Welcome to the Lalo Dagach podcast. Today I'm here again with Joshua Turner. Joshua Turner is an ex-skinhead and is now a classical liberal and humanist and atheist, all-around good guy, my friend, who has a very long and complex and drastic change in history. He's the founder of the organization called Saved by Reason, which is a secular humanist prison outreach nonprofit organization that promotes science and reason and secular values and humanism to inmates in prison. And Joshua works to try to reform people who used to hold white supremacist or Nazi ideology. And just like himself, who he was changed from having those ideas and become secular humanist and rational thinkers. And he wants to do that for inmates in prison today. And that's what Saved by Reason is all about. You can learn a lot more about that and Joshua's background in a previous episode that I recorded with Joshua, which was actually the first episode of the Lalo Dagach podcast. If you look it up on iTunes or on Soundcloud, and he's also the first to repeat guest. And thanks for coming back again, Joshua.
Well, hey, thanks for having me, Lalo. I didn't realize that I was your first guest, so that's cool for you to bring up. And
first guest and first repeat guest.
And first repeat guest. Wow, I feel pretty lucky, man. And that was a hell of an introduction. So thank you.
Anything else you want to add there, or did I do a good job?
No, wow, you did a killer job. I'm actually considering asking you to be my new freaking marketing guy on my board. No, seriously, that was great. So thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, if you guys want to check out, it was a really good episode. He has a very complex background where he's brought up as a Christian, pretty fundamentalist. He he got involved in Nazi groups, especially in prison, then had drug issues, then got out of it through reading science books and atheist books like Richard Dawkins, and then got involved in a lot of movements, completely steered away from white supremacist Nazi ideology. So recently in the news, since about a few months ago, there was the leader of the alt-right named Richard Spencer. He created the term alt-right and the website, and he's known for being a white nationalist. You know, there's some distinctions there between white nationalism and white supremacist. You know, tomato, honestly, in my consideration. But he doesn't refer to himself as a Nazi, although he's held rallies and events where he does the Nazi salute and everybody's doing the Nazi salute. So there's a lot of gray area where he says he's not a Nazi. Aside from that, I had an episode with a blogger and podcaster named Dan Arel, and that was episode 9 of my podcast. And Dan Arel held the position that Nazis should be punched. That conversation was sparked because Richard Spencer was being interviewed on the street, and a member of one of these kind of anti-fascist, what they call anti-fascist, although I consider them fascist myself, but one of these anti-fascist groups called Antifa or Black Bloc or some, just various groups. It was a guy in a black hoodie, face covered, comes and punches Richard Spencer from the side. And that sparked not just national but international conversation with a lot of websites asking whether it's okay to punch Nazis. And I was quite surprised about the widespread belief that it's okay to punch people for what they believe, even if it is Nazism. And a lot of these people have very big platforms sometimes, and they're not just random trolls. Some of these people are like Dan Arel. So I had a very long conversation about Dan Arel where I asked him in depth about his position and how he can justify violence against people for what they believe, even though it is pretty egregious. And I was pretty satisfied with the conversation that I questioned his beliefs enough that I saw a lot of holes and ethical issues in what he was doing, and the conversation was used a lot by other people to kind of dig into how do you justify ethically this this use of violence on others. But aside from that, I also wanted to get a secondhand opinion from a person who I guess I could consider more of an authority, not on punching Nazis, but on the efficacy of what Dan claims that the punching does. And also, there was a lot of trouble in defining what a Nazi was, and there was even things some there that Dan was saying, well, Nazis believe X and Nazis believe Y. For example, he said Nazis specifically believe in genocide, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of those things, I can't say for sure myself, but a lot of those things seem exaggerated or untrue. So here with Joshua, who was in neo-Nazi groups in prison, joined neo-Nazi groups in prison. This was in California, I believe, right?
Mm-hmm.
You experienced this. So it's in California. And this is mostly what we're talking about in that conversation about the U.S. neo-Nazi groups. So there's a lot of questions I have, and I know there's a lot. Joshua heard the podcast and has done some research on this. So just in general, this topic, how do you see it?
I see it basically as a freedom of speech issue. As a lot of people have argued, I know Peter Boghossian was arguing on Twitter with some people that were advocating punching Nazis, that it's a freedom of speech issue, and if you, in this country, we can believe and say whatever we want, and as soon as you cross that line and you break a law and act on those beliefs, that's when you cross the line and break a law, and that's when you should be arrested and not even really punched in that case. So what I see this as is basically just the same thing that the Nazis are doing, just the extreme on the other side.
I totally agree. And when you say free speech, it's a common thing that people say, well, hate speech is not free speech.
Right.
I personally disagree with that. And luckily, my personal belief matches the law, actually, in the United States. Actually, hate speech is free speech. Westboro Baptist Church, for example, are one of the biggest haters of the haters in around in the U.S., right? The Westboro Baptist Church go to funerals of soldiers or other people who have passed away. They show up at their funerals past a certain line, and they have signs up saying, this person died because he was a fag and God hates fags, and just the most horrible things that you can imagine being said. They're holding signs and they're screaming it with bullhorns. It's just god awful. They were taken to court, and they were the courts came to the conclusion that they have the freedom of speech, although if they can't go on private property, they have to be behind certain laws. But when they're on public property, if they want to hold a protest, even if they're saying this stuff, they have the right to say it. And I agree. Like, it's not, people will say, well, how can you defend the free speech of these groups? It has nothing to do with agreeing with these groups.
No.
The exact polar opposite. But I'm a firm believer that almost, there might be some really particular exceptions that in the U.S. that even you can't cross in as far as like freedom of speech. But even in these extreme cases, I think groups like neo-Nazis, Westboro Baptist Church, extremist Muslims, or extremist Christians who are against homosexuality or whatever, anti-abortion, right?
Mm-hmm.
People who show up at abortion clinics, they have the right to express their opinion, even though I think it is completely horrible. You used to be in these groups. Do you agree that even like, because in the U.S., when you just think of like the worst of the worst, people think Nazis. You were in these groups. You know what they said behind even closed doors, not just at protests. Do you think that even these groups and their hate speech should be free speech?
Yeah, I absolutely do. To bring it back to what what Daniel was arguing, he was basically saying that his biggest issue with the Nazis was that they advocate for genocide, and for him that was just the type of hate speech that he couldn't tolerate. And that's just a fundamental misunderstanding about neo-Nazis in America today. When I was a neo-Nazi, I didn't advocate for genocide of any other race, and I didn't believe in the genocide of any other race. And most of the skinheads that I knew also didn't either. We felt like our race was under threat and that we needed to save it, but we didn't feel like we needed to go out and exterminate the Jews like the Nazis did. And another thing, we at the time, and skinheads and Nazis and white supremacists today will deny the Holocaust. I'm sure you're familiar with Holocaust denial. It's pretty prevalent and popular online and stuff. Websites such as Stormfront try to push propaganda and stuff that say that the Holocaust was fake. But so anyway, the reason why I brought that up is if they want to commit genocide against Jews or blacks or any other minority, why would they believe that the Holocaust is fake? You know what I mean? Like, why would they spend so much time trying to deny that the Holocaust didn't take place and that Hitler was, this good guy that was just misunderstood? And they try to say that, America and the Russians made up propaganda that the Holocaust happened, and it really didn't. They just did that to give Jews Israel back so that America could have allies in the Middle East again. So they don't even accept that Hitler was killing Nazis. So what makes Dan Arel think that Nazis today are advocating genocide?
Right. So I pointed out to Dan, which I just kind of assume is true, like despite my lack of interactions with neo-Nazis, but I said there's neo-Nazis of different degrees and not all are genocidal. Some believe in separation of races. Some believe in just the National Socialism of Hitler, and interracial marriage shouldn't be allowed. They're very anti-immigration. They're very anti-homosexual. Some are religious, some aren't. But his response to that kind of nuance I was throwing in about Nazis, and he said that quote, he said when I said like not all are genocidal, particularly on that, he says there you're leaving the Nazi sphere. Then you're a racist or a white supremacist like the KKK, because they don't hold the eradication view. Nazis hold the eradication view and the white supremacist view on top of that. So that was specific to having a view of genocide or eradication of races. And he said, if you don't hold that view, then you're not really a Nazi. Is that true? Is it like how?
No,
okay.
That's absolutely not true at all. Yeah. Like I said, I was a skinhead, neo-Nazi skinhead. I was a Nazi. I consider myself a Nazi. Mm-hmm. And the guys that I ran with did too. I was with a group called Aryan Front and later prospected for a group called P9 Death Squad. And both of these groups, neither one of them advocate for genocide. There's no websites anywhere of, I don't even believe Stormfront, which is a neo-Nazi website, has any articles about genocide or anything about promoting genocide. So where he's getting, I think he's getting, the 1940 German Nazis mixed up with the neo-Nazis of today, because the Nazis in America, the Nazis in America went through a lot. We've changed a lot since the 1940s in Germany. Ever since George Lincoln Rockwell started the American Nazi Party in the 60s, Nazism in the U.S. has been evolving into something that can intergrade with American politics better than the fascist post-imperialist German Nazism of Hitler and his Nazis. So what they did was they dropped the Sieg Heil and they replaced it with white power, and they limit public displays of the swastika where the early American neo-Nazis' first attempts at recasting the group's image as a legitimate political party in the United States. So, they were white nationalists like the original Nazis, but they denied the Holocaust, and they didn't advocate for genocide. They promoted democracy over fascism. And they were capitalists, and they weren't socialists like the original Nazis were.
So So what elements do you think are prevalent mostly across the board with Nazis that make them Nazis?
Gosh, yeah, I would have to say that it's not even white supremacy, because there's a lot of prevalent, like Richard Spencer has even said he's not a white supremacist. He just believes that the white race is under attack. So I guess it would just be pro-white heritage. I guess, like, you could say.
Would you say like mostly across the board they're anti-immigration?
Definitely, because whether they want to eradicate, whether it's just this total nut that nobody listens to, that in their trailer park that wants to see all the blacks killed or hung, and somebody like Richard Spencer, who has a little more nuance to his views, they want to live separately from other races. So I would definitely say that immigration is probably a factor that ties in with all of them.
How prevalent is the eradication view, as Dan was calling it, like the genocidal? They want to just eliminate races. Like how often would you hear that from like a Nazi member when you were in prison or when you belonged to these groups?
I rarely heard it, and it was seriously what I call the fringe within the fringe that would speak that way, and they were usually people that wouldn't rise high in power. They wouldn't get recognized by people like Richard Spencer. They wouldn't have any power or influence. They were just most of the time just angry drug addicts that were doing a really long prison term. That was the only kind of guys I met ever saying something like that.
So on Richard Spencer, I mean, I don't know enough to pass judgment really if he's a Nazi, because he said, like, even I think it was just before he got punched, they were calling him a Nazi, and he's like, "Oh, I'm not a Nazi. Actually, the Nazis kind of hate me." Do you think he's playing people when he says that he's not a Nazi and the Nazis hate him, or is there some truth to that? To begin with, would you consider him a Nazi from what he said, kind of?
I consider him a Nazi. Yes, because he uses so much of the Nazi symbolism. The saluting, "Hail Trump." It's a form of Nazism that is different from what we saw in Germany. So we can't expect the same results that happened in Germany. For one, I don't think Richard Spencer would advocate for a Holocaust or anything like that if he was ever the leader. But
that's one thing. One thing is if you consider him a Nazi. The other thing is he said Nazis hate him. Could it be true that you consider him a Nazi, but could it be true that there's a lot of Nazi groups who don't like him?
There's definitely going to be Nazi groups out there that don't like him. Okay. There's a huge spectrum out there.
Right.
Lalo. I mean, there's guys out there, like I said, that are on the fringe of the fringe, that aren't taken seriously, that do want genocide. And then there's, more of the more prevalent guys that we see, like Richard Spencer, that try to be more sophisticated and come to the middle more, with their right wing politics and stuff.
So what was your general impression of the conversation about punching Nazis that I had with Dan?
I don't know Dan personally, but it just reminded me a lot of the same kind of language I would hear from sharps. And sharps are skinheads against racial prejudice. And they're basically
skinheads against racial prejudice?
Yeah, well, when skinheads first started out, it was actually in the UK, and they weren't a racist thing. They were. Yeah, it's a long story.
Is that true?
And it's a lot of history, and it's a lot to get into. But they listened to Rastafarian music, and it was like a working class type of thing. Their fathers were working class guys who had to have their hair cut short so it wouldn't get caught in the machines, and they wore Doc Martens out on the docks, because they were working class guys, a lot of dock workers. So that became like this fad among these ska and punk rocker guys in England at the time, and they called themselves skinheads. And this style came to America in the late 70s and the 80s, and at the time there was a lot of racial tensions on the East Coast and the West Coast and the big cities and stuff. So a lot of white kids that were getting picked on or felt like their neighborhoods were getting overrun took this style, this punk rock style, the skinhead style that was coming over from the UK, and they started turning it into something neo-Nazi and racist. and white supremacist. And that's the skinheads that when you hear the word skinhead today, that's the skinhead you think about, but they're not actually the first original skinheads. Anyway, so out of the racist skinheads, so in the original guys that were skinheads, they felt like they had to defend the original meaning of what skinheads were, and they actually kind of turned into this anti-fascist, very similar to Antifa. They're like this anti-fascist gang, and they call themselves sharps, skinheads against racial prejudice. And they'll have the same style as skinheads, but skinheads wear their laces. They have white laces, and they'll wear them like straight across, like a ladder up their boots, because skinheads are supposed to be straight laced. And the sharps, they'll wear their laces. They'll wear them different colors. They'll wear checkered color laces, and they'll wear them crisscrossed to show that they're not straight laced, and that they'll mix with other races. So it's just a total gang mentality that is just very similar to, it's just too similar to the skinheads for me to endorse, because they're using violence, they're using hatred and intolerance, and the same tactics that the skinheads are using to combat an ideology that they oppose. So I'm just completely against that. I feel that if there's an ideology or a bad idea out there that I oppose, I should combat it with a better idea, and not my fists or violence.
Yeah, Dan said at some point that that if we just sit back and do nothing, they win. Now, debating them or highlighting the what they say, mocking them, ridicule, I don't think that's doing nothing. It seems like Dan considers either like those who do not promote violence in the way he does, and supports groups like Antifa and things like that, are essentially doing nothing. Do you think that is there any truth in what he's saying, that without those groups and there's actually physical violence, these groups have a chance of winning?
I don't think that at all. No. I don't see anywhere in history where that might be the case here. So yeah, I definitely don't agree with his assumptions there. And another thing that he said that I disagree with was, he made it sound like he had this glass half full optimism that, getting everybody to do all this would.
I think what you're referring to is that that he said that by these groups using violence against people like Richard Spencer or Milo Yiannopoulos, that he said they need to feel a level of fright. They need to be scared to go outside. They need to be scared to show up at events. They like some kind of phrase like make fascists scared again. Something like that. So I actually I was very skeptical of that. That's the result of using violence in the way these groups are doing, that these people that he doesn't like, right? Like Richard Spencer, stuff like that, that by using violence, that these people are going to actually be scared and they're going to be less active. I think the opposite. I think they're going to feel more victimized, more empowered, more like to use violence themselves against these other groups. More they're going to feel rallied, and more they're going to feel like vindicated because of it. Am I wrong? And because you were in groups like that, and was that like what is the result when they get one of them gets a beat down? Do they all cower down and it's like we're just not going to go outside anymore? We're not going to do rallies anymore?
No, most skinheads that I know aren't pussies. These guys like grow up in the street and they're fucking tough. And if you're going to walk up and sock one, you better be ready to get rocking and, to prepare for a fight. And they'll come back with more guys. And, even if that's not the case and you assault, somebody like Richard Spencer or somebody that's, a little more sophisticated, they're going to use that to their advantage, as you were saying. They're not stupid. They know that there's going to be some fascists there or some sharp members there, and they're going to try to provoke them. And I've seen it happen. They try to get those people to punch them. They try to provoke them because they use that to their advantage. They load the videos to their their YouTube channels, and they go, look, there's another sharp punching me, just for marching down the street. And it fuels their narrative that they're victims. So, that's absolutely right there. I totally agree with you. It's just not something that is solving anything. It's just making it worse. It's adding more fuel to the fire. But what I was saying before that I disagreed also with Dan on was he had like a glass half full optimism that the assaults on these people who advocate genocide with a significant amount of power and influence will be carried out perfectly, by just everyday citizens that, see a neo-Nazi that are promoting genocide. He just thinks that it's going to work out perfect, and that there's not going to be any issues with people going to jail or anything. Everything's going to I just felt like he thought that all the exact criteria that he spoke about during the podcast.
That was my biggest criticism personally. I think a lot of people got different things out of my podcast and my questions because I asked a lot. My biggest criticism by the time it was over of his position was that I asked him, like, do you think that people are going to do this perfect level of violence where it's just going to be a punch? They're not going to bring guns. They're not going to bring knives. They're not going to be stabbing people in the head. It's not going to get out of control. And they're going to hit the right people, right? They're not going to just start punching people they consider Nazis for, for example, people who don't identify as Nazi, but people think, well, MRAs are as bad as Nazis, right? Men's right activists are as bad as Nazis, and they'll hit them too. So he's like, no, they're going to have this perfect consideration. Well, they'll have the right criteria of who is a Nazi, that they have that Nazi holds an eradication genocide view, and that they will hit them just in the right way, and it's not going to spiral out of control. I was also, that was the thing where I don't buy that at all.
Yeah, that's complete starry-eyed optimism. There's just no way that would happen. Somebody like me, I'm a former neo-Nazi. I don't hold any genocidal beliefs, and I never have. But I have a swastika-like tattoo still that I haven't had a chance to get covered up or taken off. And in your podcast, Dan said that somebody with a swastika or a neo-Nazi tattoo in his eyes is a neo-Nazi and should be punched. So somebody like me, if Dan saw me down at the river, he'd punch me in the face, not even know who I am. You know what I mean? Just because of that tattoo on my side, and I don't even identify with that. So there's just a lot that can go wrong, and I just don't think he's taken that into account seriously.
For example, he brought up Milo Yiannopoulos and the violence that occurred. I think it was at Berkeley, right? That where there was fires. There was public property destroyed. People were hit and hurt pretty severely. And Milo was at probably the peak of his popularity. Trump tweeted about that protest, right? That maybe, hey, we have to defund Berkeley. He had his book deal. He was being interviewed a lot on the news. And just right after that, I think it was the next week, he was on Real Time with Bill Maher. And even Bill Maher got a lot of criticism for having him on. Mm-hmm. But some people online started clipping all of these interviews Milo had where he was making justification with sex with underage children that are like 13 years old. He said in some cases that 13-year-olds can consent to sexual relationships with people in their 30s. And there was a lot of clips like that. And there was a lot of things that he said. And it wasn't, the violence that occurred in Berkeley only shot him up in popularity, right? It didn't hurt him at all. Trump was tweeting in a positive way about Milo. He got on Real Time. He was at the peak, I think, of his popularity ever, thanks to the violence, thanks to the protesters. On the other hand, those people who, instead of using violence, researched what he had said, found things questionable and controversial and pretty egregious of what he said about sex with minors, put it online. It was out there, and then he had to quit from Breitbart. He lost his book deal. He gave a apology on television, and since then I haven't really seen much of Milo. I was always a supporter of Milo, not for what he said. I say I agree. I don't know for percentage, maybe half of what he said, and the other half I thought was way over the top. He would even trash atheists like crazy all the time.
Yeah.
But I was a supporter in the sense of his free speech, and I think Dan is not right in promoting the use of violence against Nazis. And so, highlight what they say. But if you do the opposite, if you do what Dan wants, if you use the violence, it makes them a victim, right? It makes them the empowered ones. It puts that Nazi in the right because he is a victim. It is illegal to hit him, right? Even technically, he's in the right. Legally, he is in the right. Why put him in that position? Right? Let him be in the position where he's talking nonsense. So what do you think about these groups as far as you know them? Like what should people be doing to this new uprising where Richard Spencer is gaining popularity? I don't think it's to any degree that it's going to be a significant popularity, but some popularity, more popularity than I think white nationalist groups have ever seen in a very long time. What would you suggest as a person who's kind of in these kind of groups? What should people do to combat them?
We just continue to bring better arguments to the table. And, I think it's great that people like Dave Rubin are having people on his show that he doesn't necessarily agree with, and, that he takes a lot of heat for having on the show. But it's just showing that this willingness to, share ideas. And, as derogatory as we find somebody's ideas, I feel that if they're in the public sphere and they're gaining enough popularity, then there's a reason. And, they must have the nation, part of the nation's ear and their attention. So, we should hear what they have to say, and we should find the holes in what because that's what I do. I teach inmates how to find holes in their beliefs and in their critical thought, and just to be better critical thinkers. And that's what we need to do, I believe, here is, just to listen to their arguments and think about it and present better arguments, and just use evidence and reason as our weapons, to strike these opponents down, you know what I mean? And not fists and intolerance and the same things that we stand against.
Well, thank you, Joshua Turner, for being on again on the Lalo Dagach podcast. Just to let people know, you wrote on your blog, savebyreason.tumblr.com. You wrote a blog post called Contending with Dan Arel, which is pretty long, but it's very detailed about the differences you had in opinion with Dan. So if anybody wants to know in more detail about Joshua's opinion on that, I think that's a very good post that you wrote.
Thank you.
The podcast with Dan was episode 9 of my podcast. Is It Okay to Punch Nazis? Was the title. You guys can check that one out. And if you want to know about Joshua, we did a podcast that was the very first episode of this podcast. And also they can find you where, Joshua?
They can find me either on Twitter at SaveByReason or on the internet, savebyreason.org.
Great. And how is your organization going?
It's doing good. We're not doing as much as we'd like to at the moment because I'm wrapping up my book proposal. But as soon as those are going out in the mail, we're going to, get back to it in full strength. But right now we're just kind of staying local right now.
And your book in the future is going to be about your life story?
Yeah. Right now, it could change, but the title right now is Saved by Reason: How Atheism Deconverted a Neo-Nazi.
I think that's a good title. I've always liked the Saved by Reason title. When you get that book published, you can come on again and talk about it and promote it. You're always welcome on here. I also really want to tell you that I wanted to talk about this the first time I interviewed you, but I just forgot at some point. But after that talk we had, I really appreciated your background compared to mine, in the sense that you were never given a chance to like think critically, think rationally, think scientifically, versus my background. And you got there all the same, right? You still got there despite all the things you were in. If anybody who listens to my podcast with the first one we did, your family was really religious, hold some very fundamentalist kind of ideas. You got into neo-Nazism. You were in prison. You got involved in drugs, and through all of that, you still got out, and you're the secular humanist atheist doing this deconversion of people in prison. And I admire you a ton, and thank you for being on and always helping me present that perspective, which I think is indispensable right now, considering the conversations on race and very polarized politics right in the world, and especially in the US right now. I think a person with your background and experience is indispensable. So I wish you only the best in your projects and everything you're doing.
Lalo, thanks, man. I really appreciate it. I really couldn't have done it without the material that was out there. Books by Richard Dawkins, and not even that, but podcasts by people like yourself. Just, talking about these subjects and stuff is what helped me change my mind. So I just want to thank you and people like you that are out there doing the good work. I couldn't have done it without people like you guys. So I return that gratitude and thanks, bro. And have me on the show anytime. I enjoy it.
Thank you, Joshua. Take care.
All right.